Ricardo Baca right here. I'm a journalist, formerly with the Denver Post, and I started the Cannabis, was part of a cool documentary project called Rolling Papers. If you've never seen it, it's on Netflix. And now I have an agency called Grasslands. We work with businesses, PR, marketing, thought leadership in highly regulated industries like this one. But enough about me. I would love to pass the mic down to this lovely panel and panelists. Maybe take 60, 90 seconds, give the audience an idea of who you are, how you found yourself here today. Let's go ahead and get started with you, Imani.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Imani Cheers, and I'm a professor of digital storytelling at George Washington University. I'm also a filmmaker and an advocate in particular for communities of color and marginalized individuals. I have been working a lot around advocacy-related work, and my goal is to provide resources for underrepresented communities, in particular African Americans, African American women, around ways in which they can maximize media to advocate for issues that are important to them.
Wonderful.
Excellent. My name is Adam Eidinger. I am the Social Action Director for Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps.
Yeah, right?
I've worked in communications for many years. I even worked with the Marijuana Policy Project back in 1999 when the Institute of Medicine report came out. So I've had a lot of history of organizing press events, media stunts, political activities, and I'm very active with DCMJ, a local community organization.
I'm Steve Fox with VS Strategies out of Denver, although I'm based here. I've been working on marijuana policy issues since 2002 when I started federal lobbying with the Marijuana Policy Project. Started the National Cannabis Industry Association in 2010, seeing a need to help educate members of Congress that there was a regulated industry out there with real tax revenue, real jobs, and so on. And then most notably, I guess, for this conversation, started a project in 2004 in Colorado to change the image of cannabis to help people understand that it was less harmful than alcohol, and there was no reason to punish anyone for using it. And that campaign went on for years until I eventually managed the 2012 campaign in Colorado that made it legal.
Good afternoon. Shanita Penny. I am the principal and founder of Budding Solutions, a boutique cannabis business consulting firm. I'm based in Baltimore. In addition to running my business, I also lead the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And most recently joined the Cincy family, and I am the publisher for Washington, D.C.
Nice.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane West. I first became known for creating a cannabis-friendly event series in Denver, Colorado in 2014, and formed a partnership with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra for an On a High Note series where you could consume cannabis at the events. After those got shut down by the city, I founded Women Grow, which is now the largest professional network in the cannabis industry. Thank you. But I've been mostly focused now on creating a line of home goods and accessories that I want to have in my home as a daily cannabis consumer. And right now I'm in the middle of an equity crowdfunding campaign on Republic, so you can go there and check out more about our raise.
So much of what we're here to talk about in today's last panel is really cannabis and legalization's impact on media and vice versa. You saw some clips earlier from some popular shows. Do we have any closet Vanderpump Rules fans in the audience? Some Grey's Anatomy and of course Viceland. And this covers both the news media and pop culture media. And so I'd like to go through a quick lightning round with the panel as a form of a prologue and ask everybody, really, do you have an anecdote or a story or anything that is an example of how the mainstream media's coverage has changed on this subject matter in the last 5 years? And just to get us kicked off, I can throw this out there. In late 2013, the editors of the Denver Post asked me to be the paper's first marijuana editor and create a standalone vertical that would cover this seriously from a journalistic point of view. And I can say one of Steve's colleagues in Denver, Mason Tavert, very prominent activist, when I was going out to meet him for the first time to grab a cup of coffee, I knew that he is the man responsible for saying that marijuana is safer than alcohol and getting that in hundreds of publications very successfully. And remembering myself at the time, I was very new to this industry and charged with covering it responsibly. And so I just did the research before I met Mason, saying, I need to be able to tell, to have an intelligent conversation with him. Is marijuana safer than alcohol? And as a newbie, who's familiar with how to do some research on federal sites, it took me less than 5 minutes to recognize that absolutely cannabis is safer than alcohol. And that very much informed how I moved forward and ended up covering this industry, both holding the industry accountable in those early regulated days, but also holding regulators accountable. So love to pass it along to the panel. Who wants to get us started? Change in the mainstream media in the last 5 years.
Well, let me just jump in and go back beyond the 5 years just to talk a little more about that, because it's relevant to how cannabis is covered. That, being involved in advocacy and public debate at the time, it was just a constant battle working on the marijuana issue, and in a different time period where you were just constantly being attacked. And every interview that would be done would essentially be some variation of the anchor or host saying 5 bad things about marijuana, and then you would have to explain why the gateway effect was an exaggeration, why it doesn't really kill your brain cells, and so on. And it would just go back and forth. So when we did the SAFER campaign, that is what we ended, basically, in a way. We just immediately said, look, you can say that, you're actually wrong, you can do the research, but the bottom line is it's less harmful than alcohol for these objective reasons. And because of that, there's no reason to punish adults who want to use the less harmful substance. And then we would just go on and say, and now we should just regulate and tax it and so on. But every sentence just had, marijuana is less harmful than alcohol, and you shouldn't punish adults for using the less harmful substance. And that's
really
how
did
we
change
started
the conversation.
Yeah, and that is what we did in Colorado. The idea was to make the ground fertile for eventual legalization by getting people over their fears and misconceptions that had been drilled into them for decades on end.
Well, what's changed for me over the last 5 years, and more specifically the last 2 years, is the coverage that's available. My grandmother subscribes to a number of magazines, and these magazines are on the coffee table, they're in the bathroom of her house, for months. And so when I found Cincy magazine, I remember putting one on the coffee table, and the cover was of a beautiful sandwich. It was a food issue. And my grandmother did not notice that this was a cannabis publication until she opened it up and started flipping through it. But when she started to read the content, it was about health and wellness. It was about wine and cannabis. And so for her, that was something that she had never seen before. I wouldn't dare have shown her, other publications, that were around decades ago, just because they weren't her speed. Mm-hmm. But now I have something that I can share with her. I can use it to educate. And if I can do that with my grandmother, that means I can do it with other women of her age and, her background. Mm-hmm.
That's a good point, going from Skunk and High Times to Cincy, which is more mainstream, lifestyle-oriented. Jane, what's up?
It was, in addition to that, the imagery in general that is accompanying all the media and stories is the thing that I've noticed the most, because when I started my company in the fall of 2013, if you Google searched cannabis and women or weed and women, like all of the pictures were clearly like sexualized marketing images. Like truly, I could not find a single image of a like upscale woman consuming cannabis in any way, shape, or form, or in an art gallery, or in a cocktail dress. Mm-hmm. And so we were left with like a picture. Like a lot of the articles back then, it was just a picture of a weed leaf.
Right.
Like they getting pictures of people smoking to even accompany them. Then it was even more frustrating when the event started and they used these old pictures from giant festivals of huge smokeouts to accompany a story about something we were doing in an art gallery with a symphony. But more and more now that people are more comfortable having their images captured consuming, it then starts to show and how reflective that cannabis is for everyone, and that it's something that can bring benefit into everyone's lives. And it shows more and more how much we've just really had this one small counterculture group. We've been putting in all the images, and it's really something that everyone can bring into their lives.
Anything else to add?
I know the news in particular I've started to see a shift in content covering events of individuals using cannabis not only responsibly, but in a different setting besides, smoking out your bedroom or your car. And, we look at films, whether it be like a Dazed and Confused, where there's a very clear imagery that comes with the concept of marijuana or weed and the lexicon of changing the word. And we're talking about cannabis, and cannabis culture has provided an opportunity to sort of have a discussion about not only the less harmful effects, but also the benefits. And changing the conversation around this isn't just not as bad as alcohol, but there are actually a number of benefits and positivity to a regular consumption, and that in particular has, I think, helped change and sway public opinion.
Absolutely. And earned media, this next question kind of touches on that. And for anybody in the audience who isn't quite familiar with that term, when you have a story written about you that you're not paying for, that's earned media. That's you get a journalist's attention with a good press release or a pitch, and that's kind of earned media. We have some masters of earned media on the panel here, but I would argue one of the most significant ways this public perception has changed, and we know that it has because just look at the Pew, Gallup, Quinnipiac numbers, is because of the earned media gotten by some of the people on this panel, and of course, many, many more not on this panel. But Adam, I'd be curious, could you get us started on how you've
it's a great
kind of approached
segue for me, at least. Most of the work that DCMJ does is earned media. We, a year ago, gave away 1,227 joints on Capitol Hill to congressional staff. It resulted in all the organizers being arrested after a couple hours. Actually, our rights were violated, and there continued to be more press after the fact that we were within the letter of the law. We were gifting under DC's Initiative 71, which I was the proposer of as well. And I was just thinking about like the image of cannabis users on television. There's been a debate for many years in the movement about whether we should even show cannabis, or we should just show patients, or we should just show veterans. And I've taken the philosophy that you should show it all.
Absolutely.
Let's not sugarcoat what this is. Let's show it all. Let's be responsible about it. Now, I'm boycotting Viceland at this point. I won't do any media with them because I see what they do is purely sensational lately. They want to show toilets full of cannabis bubbling over. You know what? They should be coming with us to Salisbury, where there's a real drug problem that could be helped by legal cannabis. They should be going door to door with us, registering drug addicts. Because, I'm talking about people who are addicted to hard drugs, that want marijuana to be legal for themselves, that want to be able to cultivate for themselves. When we legalized in DC in 2014 or 2015, it went into effect, we invited all the press over my house, and we had 2 ounces on the table, and we smoked it. And we gave them all the shots they ever could want of people using cannabis. We had live plants there. And we staged it in a way that I thought was respectful and portrayed home cultivation. One last thing I want to mention, at Donald Trump's inauguration, we gave away 10,000 joints. Now, part of this was knowing that we were still under Obama that morning. It was our last chance. No, actually, we have not had a cannabis share that hasn't resulted badly since Donald Trump became president. But we were bringing cannabis to the White House and bringing it to DuPont Circle, and we did, I think, a total of 4 seed giveaways during the Obama years, big ones, where thousands of people came and it got lots of earned media. We did that to show the popular support that we're not alone, that we're not just policy wonks in our offices, but that the regular people who don't work on policy 24/7 can have a say, they can be part of this. And even now I'm saying, like, we still need regular people to show up at the polls. We still have to vote out politicians that aren't listening, that are too slow to get with the programs. So yeah, I think demonstrating in public that there is public support and it's diverse. I mean, at the inauguration, we had Trump supporters marching alongside Democrats and anarchists. 1,000 people marched from DuPont Circle with joints in their hands. This type of stuff actually, I think, is important to do, and but we have to also be careful. Like, we don't want children smoking on television. That's not what this is about. And so, we do a little bit of self-regulation ahead of time, and that's an important thing. Is like self-regulate, but don't be afraid to show the culture too. Thanks.
Yeah. And Steve, the media stunt is certainly something that's familiar to you and some of your colleagues. I was covering some of these press conferences in Denver years ago. Can you speak about some of the successes you had in getting a message heard for very little to no cost, and how that might have differed from what Adam did out here?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's similar, and Adam and I have known each other for a long time, and I think admired each other's ability to generate media. But when I was working with Mason on SAPER, there was also an intentional effort to always have him wear a suit and tie. Everything he did. I mean, he, called the mayor, John Hickenlooper, who is now governor, way back in 2005, we set it up so that when he was on TV doing an interview, that he was just going to drop the idea that Mayor Hickenlooper was a drug dealer, because Mayor Hickenlooper, and now Governor Hickenlooper, made his fortune selling beer. And he was giving us a hard time about marijuana. And we went outside his office and had a big sign that says, "What's the difference between Mayor Hickenlooper and a marijuana dealer?" And said, "Mayor Hickenlooper deals a more dangerous drug." So we pushed the envelope like that and challenged him to a duel. Mason in his suit and tie said, "I will, we're going to meet at high noon, and I'll smoke for as long as you drink, and we'll see, see who does better."
That's great.
So it was just really pushing the envelope at the time. I mean, this is like a different era from now, where things are clearly accelerating. But back then, it was just do whatever you can to get attention.
And that's red meat to a journalist. Earlier, 2 panels ago, we had Kayvon Kalatbari up here speaking. And he used to be known for putting on a full head-to-toe chicken suit, and he was Chickenlooper, who was always kind of tormenting Hickenlooper, the mayor and now governor. But
that was with us and Mason. Kayvon was one of the first volunteers for SAFER.
Sure. Anybody else have experience using earned media to help change public perception? Because I think, Jane, this was a big part of your career arc.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the advice I have is that in order to stay in the news, you have to stay newsworthy. It's that simple. That's what earned media is. You have to actually earn the attention of the journalists. So it started with the event series, which was, I did not expect the amount of media attention that was received by the very first cannabis-friendly event that was ever held in Denver, Colorado. I mean, there was CNBC and Al Jazeera, and it exceeded any of my expectations. The first time I'd ever talked to a journalist about anything in my life. But after 2 or 3 months of cannabis events, even with the city coming after them, they're not as interesting anymore. So you might need to partner with the Colorado Symphony Orchestra. Now that would make them interesting again. That's newsworthy. Mm-hmm. And then, you might have to have a concert at Red Rocks. And so you have to keep thinking about what's next and how to keep building what you're doing, because if people start reading your stories, they're gonna start following your story. So you have to start making that story. And then when it became clear that the events were starting to come to an end, but I was getting so much attention of people who wanted to know, how do I get in the marijuana industry? How do I get more involved? I want to meet other people around me that are starting businesses in this space. And so then as soon as you get as big as you can with the first story, you pivot, do something else. And that was Women Grow, which then at that time it was the right time, it was the right place for women and professionals to start coming together on a monthly basis in their local areas to start forming those business networks that are necessary to succeed. And so that was a pivot, and then that story started growing. So you have to just kind of stay on your toes and keep really, truly building things in the space. And every time you have an opportunity to be interviewed, make sure you're thinking about what you're saying now, how it's going to be received, and what you're going to say in the future.
Well, great. Let's move beyond the news media, because I'd love to talk about what happens when marijuana infiltrates entire cable networks or reality shows or top scripted television shows on the major networks that are coming to us over the air. So what's good about this coverage, this normalization? What's bad? Imani, maybe you could get us started, if we're working toward a more responsible industry and trying to portray responsible use and being examples of that ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the one hand, and I want to preface this with I love Shonda Rhimes. I think she's outstanding and amazing and phenomenal. I would have hoped that episode where all the members in Grey's Anatomy accidentally eat some weed cookies, and then everyone just has the munchies and hanging around. Like, I wish the conversation would have went towards aspects of, a patient coming in and wanting to get off of opioids and having marijuana be an alternative, or a patient suffering from depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress, being offered the option and changing the narrative. So on the one hand, the narrative is still in this sort of fun space, but I of course would like to see things in an advocacy-related space where we're having a conversation about not criminalizing the use and normalizing the new normal of this being an alternative and a healthy, positive alternative versus something that is just sort of fun and jovial, right? Like, we've sort of seen that, and I would love to see examples where it's different. And so far, outside of maybe a couple, earlier this week watching Vice News, not Viceland, Vice News, where they did an entire segment around, in particular, the comparison of, we look at, right now, the cannabis industry is still predominantly white male. And how the individuals who have had their lives destroyed by incarceration as a result of the industry are predominantly people of color, and how they are now being pushed out of even financially joining the business and entrepreneurial aspects of the business. So it was a really interesting segment that went further than what I would see on a CBS, ABC nightly news, but it went in depth, and it was a really interesting conversation that I don't think we're having in a larger space. Again, also around like the visuals that we see, all the segments where we're embracing cannabis in a wider, more popular space are still not spaces that are filled with people of color, and they're not run by people of color. And that's what I'm hoping we'll see more of, celebrating. I saw there was like one Now This News piece about a sister in Oakland, if I'm not mistaken, who had opened up a dispensary. We're talking one out of thousands, and I'd like to see that, the imagery in particular on television, shift towards highlighting advocacy and then more people of color.
Shanita, props.
We gotta do better.
And Shanita, I know you're with the Minority Cannabis Business Association, which, by the way, the Opportunity Summit in Denver last month, the single best cannabis event I have ever been to.
Yeah, right on.
Props, that was so necessary. But I mean, do you think are we expecting too much out of Hollywood or New York news for them to take this seriously and not take the easy punchline?
Right.
Absolutely not. We have to embrace and highlight and celebrate the doctors, the lawyers, the botanists that are getting into this industry. It's not just about a basketball or football player or a rapper who's able to get into the industry, right? Mm-hmm. We have folks that are not only running successful businesses, but also doing the work of advocacy to ensure that others can join the industry in whatever facet that they'd like to. And when you talk about just going back to the earned media piece, it's how we survive. Tori, you asked the question earlier about how we get the message out about the work we're doing. We need to leverage these platforms that are becoming so widely viewed and listened to talk more about the policy work that needs to be done, the social justice, the criminal justice reform that is being done and needs to be done. And that's not gonna be funny. It may not be entertaining, but it's highly necessary. And that's what I'm focused on. I don't wanna be on TV smoking. I do it every single day. You won't be entertained by that, but I do want you to come see me, you know, at an opportunity summit, at a policy summit where we are actually changing what's happening in this country beyond just legalization and business opportunities.
Absolutely.
Can I just follow up on this?
Please.
You know, in the last month, DCMJ has organized four different protests at Housing Authority, the Housing Urban Development, the Veterans Administration, DC Housing Authority, DC City Council. At each of these demonstrations, we promised to give away cannabis, which we did, and that always attract the media. But when they got there, they saw that this was a very serious issue. We're talking about tens of millions of Americans in legal or medical states being discriminated against because they receive a housing voucher or because they live in a soldier's home because they lost use of their limbs and they need full-time care, but they have to have a friend sneak in cannabis. The people who fought or put their lives on the line for this country are treated like criminals in their housing. It's really outrageous, and it's because the media has focused very much, and I'd say the policy advocates were somewhat guilty of this too, on setting up a sustainable business model. And they're envisioning, you know, the price of cannabis staying very high. They're envisioning ad revenue potentially for the news networks. Some cable news networks like Viceland has put, you know, a lot of money into cannabis being their identity. And there's just, you want to see cannabis on TV? Well, just turn it on. So, but what we're trying to do with the sensationalism, as to be clear, is to draw attention to these social issues which have been totally overlooked. And you know, when I proposed home cultivation as Initiative 71, and I'm the proposer of the initiative, it was because, yeah, thank you. It's the democratization of the production of the plant. And I don't believe there's legitimate public interest in putting it in the hands of just a few businesses, especially big businesses. I think we should have home-based businesses first before we have national businesses. Thank you. And in DC, you know, we have meetings at public libraries every 2 weeks, and you know, 30 to 50 people show up every 2 weeks from all across the city. And the number one thing we hear is, I don't feel secure in my home, and why can't I sell my surplus cannabis I grew myself? And people are selling it. It's underground. I want to note that, you know, the USDA Organic Program allows people to sell organic produce at farmers markets without inspection up to $26,000 a year. So we could actually set up a home-based model nationwide before we do a national pharmaceutical corporate model. Thanks. And I think that's what most people want. And if politicians were to wake up to this, they would be saying, well, I'm for home cultivation. I'm not so sure I'm for big corporations pushing cannabis on children. And that's the big fear we hear all the time is like, oh, what about the children? Okay, let's start with home cultivation then, because there's no business that has an incentive. You grow it if you want to grow it. But so, I just want to point out that like the sensationalism, we always try to steer it to something serious. The giggle factor has definitely come down over the years. It really has.
Yeah,
and,
the puns.
And now it's like, you know, I remember I was on Kojo Namdi, it's a local NPR station, a show I should say, in 2013. And I said, you know, I think marijuana legalization is a bigger issue than abortion. And all of them attacked me. What are you talking about? Women would disagree with you. And I said, well, you know, how many women are going to jail for abortion? And how many millions of people are going to jail every few years for cannabis? You know, and I was like, I think when you sitting in jail and you got unlucky enough to be busted, you might think it's a bigger issue if you're sitting in jail.
Steve, I want to kick it to you in 1 second, but one quick follow on that, Adam. You mentioned that the news stations, the journalists come out when you promise, hey, we're giving away weed. What do they do when they get there and you're talking about a very serious issue like housing? Do they cover you
They totally
fairly?
cover
Do
it
they
straight,
stay?
and they actually are pleasantly surprised that it's a more serious demonstration than what we induced them with the sensationalism. But when they got there, they realized, wow, every one of these speakers, either they live in public housing or they have friends who are in public housing. They're making reasonable points. Same thing in front of the Veterans Administration when you have veterans speaking out. We could do this every day of the week, and there's always a news outlet looking for the story. Like, it is a matter of doing it a lot. You can't just do it once or twice a year. And sometimes you get no press. Sometimes it is a bust. And then you do it for yourselves. You do it for the community of activists. One last thing, you got to flex the muscle, to keep it strong. And so if we become sort of, resting on our laurels as advocates, if we don't keep flexing that muscle, we will get weak, and we will see rollbacks of our rights. So we're always on the offensive. And this whole housing issue, we're being attacked in D.C. by Andy Harris, and we're having local laws. We're being prevented from writing local laws. So we took on a new front, something that no one was talking about. And sometimes you got to go on the offensive rather than the defensive when things are looking pretty grim on one side. Find a new area of battle, if you will.
Sure. And
Sorry,
very
speaking a long
smart, and I'm
time.
glad to hear that the journalists who showed up at these places covered these issues and stories responsibly. Steve?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the Vanderpump Rules video
Yeah.
and all that. I mean, which
Back to Bravo
seems
reality TV.
happy and
shows,
light.
okay?
Yeah, but no, I asked them to show that video because that is another part of what we're doing, and it really is. If you talk about over the last 5 years, the changes that there have been, it's on these shows. I mean, I put out a book with Mason and Paul Armentano at Normal a number of years ago about marijuana being safer, and there was a few paragraphs in there about the real world on MTV, and saying that it's not really the real world because all they do is drink all the time, and no one ever uses cannabis. And you think about television, and that is just universal. Everyone is just drinking and drinking and drinking, and that was true on Vanderpump Rules for seasons 1 through 7 or whatever it is. But they've gradually started to talk about marijuana more, and they had that, and they mentioned, I had weed, I felt better the next morning. It's now being part of it, and you have shows like Entourage where they. What I thought was great is they would have scenes where they just started smoking cannabis. They wouldn't mention it, but they would just be using it, and that is real world. And that's what we're starting to see change, and that is really important. And we're in terms of the work I'm doing, we're only at the very, very beginning, because we still have a culture where alcohol is wholly acceptable and creating a very, very dangerous culture, especially on college campuses. And college campuses are still basically a no marijuana zone and an alcohol-free zone or an alcohol-allowed zone. And it is very dangerous. And I have girls going to college, and I just tell them, watch out for alcohol. Watch out for alcohol. That's all I say. So.
And I think these media placements are incredibly meaningful, even though they're on Bravo. But at the same time, you have another Bravo show, Top Chef, just wrapped up its season, entirely filmed in Colorado. I watched every episode. I love that show, especially when it features my home state. And not a single mention of cannabis, even though we're the first state to implement adult use legislation.
Sure they were using it.
It's my understanding that has a lot to do with the individual channels' advertisers. That they don't want it to go straight from a shot of someone smoking cannabis to the main advertisers on those channels. That's my impression, but
Especially if it's a beer ad.
no, definitely. Right. I would just wanted to comment on it seems I feel like one of the biggest challenges we're going to face is the diversification of everyone's interests now. Because with Steve and Mason and the original people who really had a concerted effort for to leverage the media to legalize cannabis, it was the safer campaign. Marijuana is objectively safer than alcohol, and it was very focused, and it was something we can all agree upon as the main thing we needed to get over that finish line in Colorado. But now, with so many different entrants, are we talking about expungement and reparations? Are we talking about getting people jobs in the space? Are we talking about small business? Are we talking about home grow? There's so many things. But one of the reasons why Steve was so successful was the brevity, the simplification. Marijuana is objectively safer than alcohol.
And we could repeat that over and over again. So I encourage you, as you all go out there trying to affect change in the world, keep it simple. It has to be digestible. It has to be focused. It has to be repeated thousands of times for people to also then start repeating it themselves. And I also encourage you, when I first started, and I'd never had any experience speaking to journalists before, I'd write down the 3 questions that I thought they'd probably ask me, and then I'd record myself answering them. And when you hear yourself answering your questions, it's just a really valuable, very short exercise you can do right before an interview so that you're really refining your message and saying the right thing.
It's a good point, and whether we're listening to these television characters talk about it or talking about it ourselves, ultimately we're starting a conversation. And to paraphrase one of my friends and clients, Steve D'Angelo, he always challenges every audience he speaks to go out into the world and tell your friends and family that you consume cannabis if you do. I consume cannabis every day. So I don't know about you, but maybe you're going home and posting it on Facebook or telling your grandma or whatever that ends up looking like. But I think change continues there. And of course, some of us are more experienced at that than others. But I want to look ahead to this year's election. Obviously, incredibly important. Media is already playing a huge role, and we've been monitoring these elections from presidential election cycles to midterms. And we found that this issue is becoming increasingly more and more important. Certainly some of the big wins have come on those presidential election years, but let's not forget 2014 when we saw Oregon, Alaska, and DC in a midterm pass adult use legislation. So going into 2018, I'll ask the panel, what role will cannabis play? But also, at the local level, at the federal level, and where are we at now? Because we know that cannabis has never been a primary issue. Is it a primary issue now, or is it secondary, tertiary? And maybe somebody disagrees with me that maybe it is a primary issue, but who wants to get us started? How about Adam?
All right,
I know you
happy
have a
to.
personal role in this, and maybe you can tell the crowd in case somebody doesn't know about what you're going through right now.
Well, I think marijuana drives people to the polls. If they know it's on the ballot in some form, whether it's a referendum on a particular candidate or whether we're talking about an initiative or a referendum itself where the voters can actually approve the law. We're running out of states now to do that. I think we're down just to a couple left that haven't actually put cannabis on the ballot in some form or another. I recently moved to Salisbury, Maryland, about 2 hours east of here. I still have a home in DC, but I'm renting a home there for purposes of voting and reaching out to voters in the 1st Congressional District of Maryland, where Andy Harris, who has meddled with DC's cannabis laws and now is preventing us from passing any reform. So we're literally bringing the marijuana advocates from DC to the Eastern Shore to register voters, get them to look at the candidates in the Democratic primary as alternatives. In particular, there's a woman named Allison Galbraith, who I'm supporting. Personal. This is all personal stuff, by the way. You got to do this on the weekends. You can't really do this for a living. Otherwise your income will suddenly become part of the campaign's expenses. So, to keep things above the board, this is like a personal thing. And but a lot of DC residents were out there with me. We've knocked on 400 doors last weekend, and we're learning so much. Actually, yeah, thank you. It's amazing. We're learning so much about the people in Andy Harris's district that there is a huge drug problem, and it's opioids, and it's other hard drugs, extremely hard drugs that are deadly. And people told us, well, I don't smoke marijuana. I would, but it smells up my house, and the police will have probable cause to come in if they smell it. So I just use hard drugs. And I actually had people tell me this, and I'm like, well, why don't you register to vote? Because you're not registered to vote, and you can help to change these laws. Because if you don't turn on to politics, politics is going to turn on you. And people are responsive. And one last thing I want to say is a lot of times people say, no, I don't want to register. Why would I want to vote? I don't care. And then as soon as you say, well, it's about marijuana, oh, really? And you find out the reason they can't stand the U.S. government or local government, for that matter, is because they associate it with policing around marijuana. And that colors their entire perspective on being a citizen in such a negative way. They don't even participate anymore. And I know how to break that down, and I'm training people to break that down, and we get these people to register. Just with talking, a little bit of talking, oh, wait, maybe it's in my best interest to vote. It is. So anyway, I've spoken enough, but...
Yeah. Imani, what do you think as we approach 2018 election? Primary issue is cannabis, or are we not there yet? Is this still a secondary, tertiary issue?
I think depending on which community you're referring to, the level and the importance varies. So I know in particular for the African American community, yes, marijuana has its impact, but we're also just trying to exist without being murdered in the street in complete impunity and mere existing. But when you also look at the building of communities and the rebuilding of communities and what I believe are the necessary reparations for the mass incarceration of people of color based on these drug offenses that now we're seeing are multi-billion-dollar industries, and how there needs to be that right wronged, or that wronged right, it's going to be challenging. So I know a number of people are focusing on obviously registering individuals for not necessarily just the purpose of marijuana, but for understanding that for those who are disenfranchised based on a number of things, there's a lot there. So we're trying to focus, and things are divided. There's a lot to focus on, but it all sort of comes, unfortunately, back down to a variety of very strong roots, roots of oppression and hatred and racism and sexism and patriarchy that are challenging. So yes, to answer your question, marijuana, the legalization, the spreading of the wealth that comes from cannabis culture and the industry is incredibly important, but the varying levels are going to differ depending on the community in which you're referring to. So the communities that I work with, I would probably put it at like number 5 on our list of 10.
Sure.
Yeah, it's there.
Pretty high up.
It's pretty high.
Top half, yeah.
Top half, it's there. But so is just kind of walking down the street. So we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have something to add on this specific subject looking ahead to the election this year?
Oh, yeah. I am not impressed by a few talking points on cannabis legalization. I am certainly not impressed with a candidate running on any campaign that's just only talking about decriminalization. Talking points are what has gotten the Black community to support a particular party for a very long time, and it has not benefited us at all.
No.
What I want to see are actionable plans once you're in office to ensure that not only are we able to participate from an ownership, and I'm going to lead with ownership, right? But I want to also make sure that that candidate is committed to going back and doing the work so that local municipalities aren't burdened with this ask of expungement and just clean slates, right? We need a real plan, because for years they come into our churches, this summer they'll be there. The New Jersey Legislative Black Caucus right now, they are in New Jersey dividing the community, decriminalization, no legalization, and it is not to our benefit.
Right.
Do you not want to be a part of this billion-dollar industry? Do you not want to see your sons and brothers and sisters and daughters, mothers, fathers freed from prison, records expunged, and ability to just live life? So, 2018, whether we're talking local, state, or federal, put your money where your mouth is.
Amen.
Contribute to the MCBA, because we're doing the work. We're handing you model legislation.
Absolutely.
Other than that, again, three, 4 bullets in a YouTube video or something like that,
Right.
Forget about it. You will not get my vote that way.
Amen.
I hear you. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I won't disagree with anything that was just said, and I'm not going to believe the lip service on its face. But I would note how far we've come. And just in the past week, with Trump and Gardner making their announcement and Schumer last night and everything going on, the Democratic presidential candidates seeming to be positioning themselves on marijuana to see who can have the best position or at least stake out a position. But I was just going to note that for those who hadn't seen it, Schumer seems to have a provision in the bill he's introducing that talks about steering funds towards minority and female business owners. So, I mean, your voices are being heard on this, in addition to the fact that we're really making so much progress in Congress that is just, for those who haven't been around for a long time, it's really, really momentous.
And this is the bill that Schumer announced last night, today, about federal decrim. We only have a minute left, so I would love to just do a quick lightning round, give the audience something to leave with, something to chew on. Everybody, what's one media outlet that writes about cannabis that you trust?
Ooh, okay.
And you'd recommend others to trust. And in fact, I'll get us started just so you guys aren't completely taken by surprise. But, I'm biased. I started the Cannabis inside the Denver Post newsroom. I think they do a very fair job of covering the market, holding everybody accountable, producing real journalism. So I'll throw that out there. Who wants to go next?
I'll say Vice. I really enjoy Vice on HBO.
Vice News.
Vice
Sure.
News, yeah.
The MAPS Bulletin, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I mean, it's only twice a year, but it's worth it.
Tom Angel's Marijuana Moment, and his Twitter feed is on top of everything. It's really all you need to keep on top of the news. Amanda Chicago Lewis, who was just here,
Absolutely.
does great work. The folks who are really dedicated to the issue tend to do better work, like at the Cannabis, Green State, like David Downs in California, Dan Adams and Josh Miller in the Boston Globe. Those who are focused on it. AP just set up their own cannabis division, so
right.
It's where folks jump in and out, and they just put a reporter on coverage. Those people. Oh, Chris Ingram at Washington Post.
Absolutely.
A lot of folks who have been doing a lot of work, and they know the history of this, and they understand that one report about driving isn't really everything about driving. They'll put it in context.
Shanita?
Trust. Whew. I like what the Huffington Post is doing in terms of coverage, because it's been not just about business, but also about the advocacy work that's taking place in the industry. And when it happens, just like every other thing that they report, I will never trust Fox News.
Right. And speaking to that, Matthew Ferner is the national reporter for HuffPo, who does cover this subject matter, so definitely follow him and Tom Angel and all these others on Twitter. But Jane?
My answer is that there's not one specific one. Instead, I feel like so many journalists and people covering the space are so new to it, far newer than the people they're interviewing. There's not journalistic experts per se. So in general, if I find something that I find particularly interesting or that catches my eye, I try to find 3 other people that have reported on it. Is this real? Is this the actual facts that are here? So I would say keep a good mix of and ideally follow some people whose opinions you trust. That's what I'm most likely to do. Is like Dr. Julie Holland out of New York City. She's amazing, and if she shared it, I am reading it. So I more curate the people I follow and read what they read.
And Jane brings up something really important. What we share is meaningful because that's ultimately everything. That's your credibility in an era where half of Americans have a very different definition of what false news actually is. I would encourage you, be incredibly conscientious, intentional about what you share, whether it's on social media or you're sending something to your aunt. But everybody, I would love a healthy round of applause for our panel, please.